Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Black Mesa review. Black Mesa actually released earlier this week, believe it or not. The public beta did anyway, so it's fairly recent. Looking at the game would not tell you so, but it's by a group of people that go by the moniker Crowbar Collective, ignoring the obvious simulation in the first fourth of that moniker that they go by. We're just gonna truck on through and talk about the actual game that we played. And I actually think, unironically, it's important to define game here, because after interacting a little bit more broadly with some of the people who are a lot more favorable when it comes to their outlook on Black Mesa than I am, and they received it a lot more favorably, and they actually enjoyed Zen, for example, and at least as far as I can tell, have not cited a single complaint even about the visuals, let alone about the pacing and so on and so forth. Because of that interaction, I think it's important to talk about what makes a game, and I guess what I'm referring to when I talk about a game, because we all have our own lexicon, we all draw upon our own personal dictionary to some extent when we're talking about stuff, particularly when you're handling analysis. It can be helpful to really just get everything up there up front so that people can decide if they agree or disagree, but more importantly, so that they can at least understand that if you have a radically different approach or result of your analysis, they can understand how you may have gotten there a little bit better just by knowing your terminology and what it actually means. So as far as I'm concerned, in order to be a game, a video game or otherwise, you have to demand some amount of interactivity. And that has to be the vital focal point of the entire production, be it a sports game or an actual real life sport or any sort of game, any video game, any real life game you can think of. Chess, backgammon, fucking Snakes and Ladders, StarCraft, Black Mesa, Half-Life. You know, if you're going to be a game, then your primary motivating factor, and I would say the vast majority, 99.9999% repeating, of your game has to be about interaction. That means there should be very little, if any, sitting around waiting for some event to happen so that you can play again. Should be very little, if any, restrictions on what you can do other than playing. You have to play, but other than that, there really shouldn't be too many restrictions when it comes to what you can or cannot do within the game. And it's easy to conflate this with the idea that you should design your levels and your arsenal such that the player has a lot of options. That's not really what I'm saying. I'm saying the player has to be able to play at all points. Or 99.99% of your game has to have gameplay as an avenue for player expression. The player has to be able to say, this is what I want to do. I want to play a game. I'm going to play a game for most of this experience, right? The vast majority. And obviously, by those standards, Half-Life, Black Mesa, etc., are not games. I suspect Deus Ex will also fit into this when I eventually play that. But they're more about following around, going down linear corridors, walking simulator, when you are allowed to play, especially in Zen. You'll notice there's a huge amount of walking simulator areas. But sure, whatever. At the very least, by this very, very bare bones definition of what a game is, you are required to input in order to move there. Yet the cutscenes that aren't actually technically cutscenes, except for the one where you're being hauled off and thrown into the gutter. I always laugh at that in the original Half-Life and, of course, in this game, because the fans of this game talk about how the fact that there's no cutscenes in Half-Life makes it one of the more revolutionary FPS titles, but that is undoubtedly a cutscene, and it's not quite a short one either. So the idea that one could go under the radar, I don't know about that one. Nonetheless, we do arrive at the first key distinction. Just because you can move around during these cutscenes doesn't mean that that is playing a game. And this isn't hair-splitting, because you could do the same thing if you were doing nothing and you had let go of your mouse and keyboard or controller and you had just gone off to blow a bear. Nothing would have changed. The outcome would not have changed during the time of that. We'll call it cutscene for this particular purpose, but you understand that even if it isn't expressly a cutscene where you can skip it with a cutscene skip button, or you're in cutscene mode like in Warcraft 3 or something, it's still, for all intents and purposes, a cutscene. The scripted events are going to happen in the exact order that they happen, regardless of player input, barring a few cases where you can accidentally get yourself killed, like notably in the early stages of Black Mesa. I got myself killed a few times just running around the wrong places during explosions, and I think that's probably possible in the original Half-Life game as well, but really, you'd think that would not have survived the remake. And we will be talking about the remake aspect of this whole thing, because it's kind of something that shrouds the whole thing. It hangs over it like a dark cloud, we'll say, perhaps from Dark Colony. And I just want to finish the point about this whole definition thing, because again, it's important. Definition of game requires you to interact in order to find some sort of progression. Well, cutscenes are obviously not that, and these scripted sequences are obviously not that, because again, as I demonstrated, or as I argued and demonstrated in the playthrough, you can do nothing and still have a lot of silly shit happen. But it would have happened, nonetheless. The battles resolve sometimes by themselves, you just staring there and watching. Or even better, nothing happens at all while you stare there and stand there and stare and watch. That's pretty good. At the end of the day, when you look at the definition of what a game is, to me, it requires interaction in order to proceed down that progression meter. In order to progress in the game, you must interact. You must engage with the game's systems and the game's opponents, and so on and so forth. Now, in some games, those opponents are puzzles, but even in good puzzle games, I would argue that you have to, again, engage with the puzzles themselves in order to solve them. And I haven't really played too many puzzle games, so it's kind of out of my wheelhouse, but I would allege that if people were interested in puzzles, they would be interested in stuff that demands a certain amount of engagement and stimulates their brain in a certain way. And they have to think about what the puzzle is and try maybe a number of different solutions. And I don't know exactly how you would increase stakes in a puzzle game. You'd probably have to make it like a first-person platforming game, sort of like what Black Mesa turned into towards the end, where you weren't really shooting too much. But ultimately, you would still have to interact with the puzzles. And hopefully the interactions would be more than just pushing one button at the right spot or whatever, because that's literally what a QuickTime event actually is. Although I suppose you could just also classify it as a button mash or a Simon Says or something, because maybe the time-sensitive part isn't really there. But I definitely think that it's, the reason why I opened up this whole review with discussing the terminology that we use to describe games, and in fact the actual terminology of game, is because I don't actually believe that Black Mesa delivered an interactive experience throughout most of its running time. In the bare bones sense, yes, they did. And that's why you can classify Black Mesa as a game. In the bare bones sense, yes, you have to move down this corridor. Yes, you have to, move around this arena spinning as a testicle flies at you. But at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to Simon Says, and that's just patently not interactive. That's obviously very linear. One of the advantages of having a video game is allowing a player to do something different than the next player in line in your playtesting session, or the next player that buys your game, or whatever. Players can do different things. They can express their personality in different ways. Theoretically, yes, it's possible to watch a movie or read a book in a different way, insofar as different people are going to engage with different parts of that movie or book. Perhaps one reader will read faster. Perhaps one viewer will pick up on more symbolism. Perhaps one viewer will enjoy the audio more than they enjoy the video, or something like that. But ultimately, they're still watching the same thing, and it's still linear. They're still reading the same thing. It's still very linear. It's start to finish. Doesn't go back. There's no interaction. Can't rewind. You can turn the page back. You can literally rewind a DVD or something, but you can't go back and then watch it from a different angle. You can't go back and read it from a different perspective. It's always very on rails. And Black Mesa and the Half-Life franchise in general really does not allow for enough player expression to justify it being a game in the first place, because of the fact that they are very, very railroaded. The one argument you can make in favor of the Half-Life franchise, and again, this all leads back to Black Mesa, is that you can say that you don't mind the lack of interactivity on a subjective level, because you felt that the immersion provided by the world building got to you at such a formative time that you were able to look past all of the obvious graphical errors, and you were able to look past all of the, we'll say, shoddy pacing for a lot of the dialogue and poor voice acting and etc. And you were able to look past the low craftsmanship and experience it for the novelty, the wow factor. This is a term that was used to describe Black Mesa as well. And you were able to get something meaningful out of that experience, despite the fact that the actual grade of the materials that you are consuming is very low. You were able to experience something that on its first time had some aura of novelty, was able to feel very different and distinct and unique and push some boundary or something else. But that has nothing to do with being a game. That is about being an experience that can only be relived. Well, it can't be relived patently. It can only be had once. I think it's possible to make an experience that is strictly single player and strictly linear in a sense, where it can't be open-ended, right? We have these open world games, but they still tend to have like a beginning and an end to them. And then there's New Game Plus and you can just go do some fetch quests for about 10 hours. But for the most part, I think most games are start and finish, very obvious when it ends, very obvious when it begins. Like Half-Life and like Black Mesa. And you end up going down this rabbit hole of trying to justify going all the way in the opposite direction of what Black Mesa did and what Half-Life did, where you're trying to make something that's very open-ended. But I don't think you have to do anything that's open-ended. I think you can go for dynamic as opposed to static. You can use those two things because Black Mesa is both linear and static, but all video games at some point are going to be linear. There's always a finite number of options. And even if it's not realistic to reach all of them, there's a finite number of meaningful differences in what you can do to experience the product. A finite number of guns that you can wield, a finite number of enemies that you can fight, and a finite order in which you can take certain challenges. But what you can do is allow for more permutations in the moment and demand more adaptability and have more pathways and more decision trees open up for the player themselves based on level design, enemy placement, AI behavior, etc. And I don't think that this takes a lot of abstraction to understand, though maybe if you've only played games like Half-Life, you may not even know what the hell I'm talking about because this literally never shows up in a single point in all of the Half-Life franchise. But ultimately, that is indeed seen to its logical conclusion with Black Mesa. Though surprisingly, there was one particular point in this remake of the original Half-Life that did demand a certain amount of skill at the very least, even though it was difficult for, I would argue, very wrong reasons. And that was the testicle boss fight. The only area of the entire game where I was really, I would say I was impeded in a heavy manner. And had I found the secret to victory, aka just played better, I probably would have had a much quicker time with that and maybe wouldn't have even come to this conclusion. The bulk of Black Mesa does not require any finesse from movement, any finesse from aim, any mechanical skill expression at any point. You can get through the whole game on the hard difficulty simply by corner camping, by peeking enemies that don't respond to you because their AI is dumb, and by abusing certain areas in the level, by abusing certain guns, and otherwise by trial and error. If all else fails, you can just die forever and make it through anyway. There's a few areas where I fucked myself, pardon my French, by running through and not having enough health at the certain key breakpoints, and then checkpoints would go through and I wouldn't be able to go back and get any more health, or for whatever reason, there weren't any more supplies. So I would be forced to, really just, Simon Says that one, right? Grind it out. Warcraft 3, those enemies, lure them out into the open and pick them off one by one in a very boring and decidedly uninteresting, deployment of FPS gameplay. So, to say nothing of the fact that that is now the norm, apparently. But there was one area, like I said, like I alluded to before, and you may already know what it is if you watched my playthrough. One area in the Zen level specifically that demanded that I improve at movement and to some extent precision, though that was never really an issue for me. And that area is testicle. The final testicle area, because for some reason they decided it was a good idea to stretch out not just the textures of the game, but also the entire level design of all of the worst areas in the entire original game. They needed to stretch this out in such a fashion that it encompassed 2 or 3 times the length that it encompassed before. Really, really just distasteful, I would say. So the final testicle area, you're shooting testicle in an arena, you're running around, you figure out, I've got to jump backwards. And if you're smarter than me, which I imagine most people watching this video are, you'll be able to figure it out a lot sooner. But I didn't. I took my time and that particular research, and eventually my investigation led me to realizing that I had to hold S to go backwards while double tapping the spacebar to jetpack my way to victory. Meanwhile, all you're given, as far as tools in this particular area, is a very enclosed space where you must watch where you go, because if you bump up against the wall too much, you'll die to some weird damage over time shit. I think it's those toxic vines or something. Although I really wanted to just move on to the next point, but unfortunately I have to point out that I actually don't know if that's true in this area. I just know that those are the same assets used, or very, very similar looking assets used in an earlier area where you're being chased by Testicle, and touching those does kill you. So I'm just assuming that that did happen, and I was taking some damage when up against that, but that could have been the ads, that could have been the monster cooming me, I don't know. So I'm just going to write it off as maybe that was what was happening. But either way, there's a very restricted area, and it accomplishes the same thing, is that you only have a certain area of which you're able to move around. So you're in a very enclosed space, and then you have to jump around with just your rocket launcher, because that's the only weapon you get infinite ammo for, and probably the only weapon that does good damage to this motherfucker. And you've got to blow that Testicle to smithereens. Blow it to kingdom come. Blow it to bear. And eventually you do. Eventually you get there. But I gotta say, the victory felt pretty hollow. Yes, I learned how to kite backwards, a move that probably should have been taught a lot sooner, and probably should have been facilitated a lot sooner in areas that weren't just straight line corridors. But unfortunately, there weren't really very many areas with that. And of course, we get the jetpack in the last act of the game, so it's not like I could have really adapted it much sooner. I think immediately after entering Zen, you're in this asteroid place where you've got a platform, and jumping around like that could be really dangerous as well. So maybe it's okay that I didn't realize that you had to kite backwards with the jetpack until later on. I think it should still be natural when you're getting charged at by an enemy, and I really don't know what I was smoking when I was dealing with that, but at the end of the day, you're discouraged from doing anything that reckless elsewhere because you'll just fall off and die. So, and immediately afterwards as well, you're surrounded by set piece areas where you're being chased by giant Tony Mongos. So I really don't know what was up with that. That was like a mecha man baby or something. Those guys that shoot fire at you. Man, that area sucked. But yeah, at the end of the day, the victory felt hollow because sure, you learned the skill that you'll again never learn. So gimmick. You'll never need to kite backwards ever again in the game. You haven't needed it up until this point, besides, I guess, fighting zombies or something, but not with the jetpack. You never needed to go that fast. And despite the fact that it was refreshing to have that level of mobility, and annoying that it was tethered behind 3 jetpack fuel canisters, or whatever the hell those things are that recharge, yeah, you just had very limited tools. Your arsenal was restricted to basically the rocket launcher because that was the only weapon that you had infinite ammo in. And I spent all my ammo in the earlier section in first contact with Testicle. So I didn't really have that much to throw around, we'll say. But yes, you successfully completed this weird Simon Says thing. Yes, you killed Testicle. That motherfucker had it coming too. I don't know how he could have withstood so much damage, but he did. I have a feeling it may have something to do with some trigger, as opposed to just him being a stat mob. But who knows? Now, moving on from Testicle, I guess we can just jump right into the rest of Zen. This is the stuff that's more fresh in my mind, because it's obviously the stuff that I played the most recently. But it's also, I assume, the stuff that's most fresh in the developer's mind, since it just launched very recently to the recording date of this review. I think Zen is a nice sort of way to encapsulate a lot of the problems with the Half-Life formula. And I do think that Black Mesa's developers, the Crowbar Collective, in some ways, I don't know if idolized is a fair term to use, but they certainly put up on a pedestal Valve's decision-making. And they didn't feel super consistent either, because obviously they're using Half-Life 2's engine, the same engine that Half-Life 2 is in, rather. They're using the physics from Half-Life 2. They are porting through a lot of the design tenets of Half-Life 2 back into the level design of Half-Life 1. And in some ways that's better because you do get some more open areas, although to call them open is kind of an embarrassment, but it's just more open than Half-Life 1's areas were, generally speaking. But in other ways, it winds up wasting the player's time more, and Half-Life 2 was worse of an experience than Half-Life 1. So in that particular respect, it's no wonder. It's not really, it doesn't take a scientist, it doesn't take a telepath to figure out what the hell's going on there. But you go through and you try and figure out exactly what their mind was at, where their mind was at, what was on their mind when they were putting together Black Mesa. And I do think that with Zen, it's a nice encapsulation. It's a nice microcosm of the thought process behind it. They thought there's a lot of potential with Black Mesa, or rather with Zen. There's a lot of potential with Zen. We would love to take Zen as it currently stands and we expand it to be its own area. And okay, in theory, you're talking about taking an area that was very gimmicky in the original game, that had changed gravity out of nowhere, that required you to figure out how to defeat a boss that didn't really have very many reads, and also, again, fucked around with gravity and exhibited behaviors you had no idea what they did, and you had to learn on the spot and adapt, but without any proper reads, it's pretty hard to do so until after you've already gotten annihilated, right? And you go through and you finally finish the original Half-Life game, and you're trying to think, like, what could have made that area better? Well, obviously, it being longer and allowing for more acclimatization time, and that would help it feel less of a gimmick, at the very least. That would help it feel much less gimmicky, because you'd be able to adapt to whatever subtle changes to the game state they would hopefully include at this point. But even though they did tone down or perhaps remove the gravitational elements, they did make it so that fall damage was completely negated now, and you just landed with the jets, even if you were out of fuel, which I thought was a little odd, but I don't immediately have any issues with it. I think fall damage is kind of overstated in Half-Life anyway, so it was probably fine to reduce or remove it entirely in Zen. I don't really have a huge gripe with that design decision, although it is, again, inconsistent. That's where really my issue comes from, but on its face, I don't think that's really a bad idea. On the whole, though, Zen is very gimmicky, despite the fact that they reduced the gravitational differences so that your jump height and stuff, it still feels fairly similar. You're treated to this jetpack, and it behaves very differently than the movement system of the rest of the game, very different to the movement system of the rest of the franchise that this conversion, this mod, this remake is a part of. And so you come into Black Mesa, presumably a veteran Half-Life player, and yes, you come into Zen, and now all of a sudden things have changed again. Except, yes, it is longer, so you do get more time to adapt. But what are you really doing during Zen? You're platforming around, you're trying to close gaps between rocks, Dust and Browder, of course. You're trying to jump around an arena and kite backwards, but not too far back, because you'll run into some invisible collision and get fucked, or you'll run into some toxic plants, or you'll run off of the game world and die. And then you're trying to jump forward to avoid the Mongo Men, the mecha man baby that I mentioned, that whole area where there was a billion of them. And man, that felt so fanfiction-y to me, I gotta say, because that was like, oh, it was cool when one of them attacked you. What if there were 30? It's like, more is not equal better, man. Sometimes it's better to imagine, oh, there's only one or two of these things. They're fairly rare. They're very strong. They've got retarded amounts of health, but they're very rare. Well, at least if I find them again in the next area, I'll know that there's probably only one of them. And then there's like literally, I really do think it was like 30. It was at least double digits for sure, but I don't know. It was like somewhere between 20 and 30. Maybe even more if you count all the ones in the cutscene. And so it's just so crazy to me that there was that many of them, and that they behaved as dumb as they did as well, where you just jump around in terrain instead of immediately running forward. But yeah, you're expected to run forward in that particular area, whereas you just spent the rest of the time killing Testicle and kiting backwards and shooting a giant boss in the head. So you think, oh, another giant boss in theory, except I know what this enemy is like before because I've faced them before. So perhaps there's a way for me to get around and attack him. Before I didn't have the arsenal that I have now. I've grown in strength. I've grown in competence. I have this movement ability now that I just spent the whole last boss perfecting. Let's run in here and try to kill this thing. I find out I can't seem to kill it. Perhaps it was close to death, or perhaps it was invulnerable. I don't know. There was no gameplay communication there. And then I run a little bit forward and there was another one. And then I run a little bit further than that and there's another one. And well, it's probably not going to end at 3, so there's probably about 30. And yes, indeed, there were 10, at least. Maybe 8. I don't know. The number keeps changing in my head. And ultimately, you just come through that area feeling totally ass blasted. Like, why did they do that? Why did they make it so that there was so many of them? And it comes right after killing Testicle. It comes right after, or maybe it was before. Honestly, I don't really remember. I just remember it being really dumb. And so, like, you're used to moving around, and by that point, regardless of where it slots in the Zen levels, because of course, they wouldn't expect you to jump around and run away from those things unless you were reasonably well affected with the jetpack. And just the idea that they go through all that, and man, it's a gimmicky mess. So it's still just as gimmicky, if not more, than the original Zen levels of the original Half-Life. Yet it's much longer. And it really takes the piss. I think it's just way too much. So you can't really learn any lessons. It's not like you put any of those lessons into practice when you're jumping around in the final boss, which was significantly easier than Testicle. And the only reason I didn't kill him in the first try is because I didn't realize that the shields were behaving differently now that I destroyed his first 3. And so that was so easy. They give you so much extra ammo. Again, for the rocket launcher mostly, although I did get a healthy amount of the electric area, or the radiation ammo. I don't know what the fuck it is. It's space alien ammo anime, and you kill that guy easily. Like, I had more difficulty in the area where you're dealing with mind controlled Tassadars and dealing with the Mongos in cages, the Phoenixes in cages. Those things, those flying overmind brain things or whatever. I guess that's Zeratul. I don't know. That doesn't fulfill the gameplay role of Zeratul, but he does mind control, which is a Dark Templar thing. So maybe they're infestors. Anyway, those things, those flying things that did a lot of damage and mind controlled enemies to do more damage. Those things were fucking weird. And the idea that it was such a set piece, right? And there's just so much you could talk about in Zen alone that just gets it so wrong. It goes from gimmick to gimmick, set piece to set piece, rarely, if ever, giving you any opportunity to express any skill or agency yourself. And even when you can express that skill, it's like only down this one path. You're only allowed to be good at jumping around away from Testicle. And probably the only reason you're allowed to do that is because it lasts long enough to really test your ability to press spacebar at the right times. And that's just because of the hard difficulty modifier that gives them more health, I assume. So, like, there's really nothing. I don't even know if the difficulty modifiers do anything for the AI reaction times or aggression or behaviors. But really, the only times that there was any aggression at all, especially in the Zen areas, were when you were dealing with these mind-controlled guys and the mind controllers themselves, the mind savants, or what is it, mind courier? Anyway, the bottom line is you come away from Zen and you feel thoroughly disrespected as a player. You're not ever allowed to move around at the speed of what an FPS really ought to be, which is with your jetpack, because you'll just path into something that deals damage to you or path out of the map and die. You're really not even, like, you're just expected to know a lot of stuff when there really wasn't any inkling in my head that I would ever be expected to know that. Like, they basically make a lot of assumptions. And in today's climate, you really can't be making assumptions. You know that, right? You know that by now. You can't be making assumptions. So why would you make assumptions about what a player actually thinks they have to do in a certain area? Like, if you're going to go full set piece, if you're going to go full gimmick, like, I think the lack of dialogue really hurt them. Like, in Half-Life 2, you'll notice that you actually get the player to respond to directions directly from their earpiece or whatever, because Alex yells at them or something. Whereas in Black Mesa, they didn't have that crutch. And I think that shows, because they probably would have just told you to run in those situations, which is even more disrespectful, I think, because it really makes it so that the player can't experiment and figure it out. But if you really only give them one option and it's run down a certain path and always go the same direction that we want you to go in, otherwise you'll get fucked. Like, again, we come back to the beginning of the review. Are you even playing a game? Yes, you have to interact with it, but you're certainly not playing a good game. You're certainly not playing a game where the interactivity itself is what tells the story and is what allows you to experience something that you can even call an experience to begin with, right? Because people say that the wow factor and the experience of the immersion and the storytelling and the world building, all these things can be demonstrated through gameplay. You know, you don't think that we have stuff that has no single player storyline at all, but still provides a crazy amount of storylines. Counter-Strike, StarCraft, fucking soccer, like, literally anything. Like, you don't think Tom Brady of the New England Patriots isn't some sort of icon from a story, from a legend or something? Like, the corollary would be something like fucking Theseus's shipper or something. I don't know. Like, you just have crazy shit. You would have insane stories about these people. These people are the stuff of legends. We deify them in our culture. You don't think that there's no storyline happening there. You don't think that there's no immersion happening there. People are super immersed in football. They go into the stats. It would be like me knowing the stats of every StarCraft unit or something. What kind of loser would know that kind of stuff? So, like, of course, people are immersed in shit that has nothing to do with explicit storytelling the same way that we think of from a movie or a book. And that's where I think the whole Half-Life franchise, including Black Mesa as an offshoot of it, gets everything wrong. They get the stuff that you're supposed to be a cameraman or a viewport inside a movie that you're experiencing, and you're pulling the button, you're pulling the trigger, pushing the button, doing your thing at the exact right times that we want you to do as developers. And so the player just gets shafted. All of their ability to express themselves, it gets shafted. And really what you get is people who are interested in doing that just so that they can experience the movie. Like, you know how many people are on these YouTube compilations in the comment section like, wow, StarCraft 2, Legacy of the Void, all cutscenes. This should be a movie, :D. Like, these people are looking for a movie and something to passively sit there and take in, probably in their second monitor while they jerk it furiously in the first monitor. They're not really there to experience something that demands that they get better at the game that they're playing, or that they express that they are good enough at the game that they're playing to pass the skill check. They're not looking for any of that. And certainly developers aren't providing any of that. Maybe this is a vicious cycle of people demanding stuff that's easy enough for them to deal with so that they can watch the cutscenes, and people who are too lazy enough to, or not, well, lazy enough to only make the, man, that fell apart in the second part. Hold on, retake. Maybe this is a vicious cycle of people who are too bad at video games that they are so bad at video. Fuck! God damn it! Black Mesa destroyed my brain, guys! Okay, the bottom line is, I think that developers really need to just say what will make a fun game instead of what will make an epic moment or a movie. Yes, you can have epic moments in your narrative. I try to have epic moments in my narratives as a writer. I think it's an important piece because it really is a culmination of character development. But there's no fucking character development in Half-Life because the main character is a goddamn mongoloid that doesn't speak. He's a mute. All he does is go, take it, boy. And that's it. That's his only dialogue. So, of course, G-Man comes in and molests him or whatever, but, like, why? Why is that your moment? Is G-Man giving you a kiss after you kill Gabe's son? Why? And why is everything so disconnected and discombobulated? Why is there nothing consistent about your quote-unquote game? Why can I not show you how good at your game I am? Why do I instead have to do things exactly the way that you ask me to, or tell me to, you mandate that I do, in the right order, down the right path, with the right weapon, pressing the right keys at the right times? Like, what? This may sound like I'm splitting hairs, but it's really bad in these games, all these games. And Black Mesa really does not deviate from this formula. And I don't know, I don't think I was expecting them to. Obviously, I played this because Dawn bought it for me. It's the last time I used that as an excuse at the end of a review. But that's why I played this game, and I wasn't really expecting it to be great, but the fact that it was as bad as it was, and again, you'll notice I haven't even really touched on the graphics. Like, I made some snide comments throughout the review about how bad the game's graphics were. They stretched the textures or whatever, but this game's graphics were some of the most fucked up I've ever seen, and I don't even give a shit about the game's graphics enough, how offensive they were, to comment on that. For all I know, there's some weird graphic driver thing, or some shader thing that was going wrong, or some shit that's going to get fixed soon, and it's not supposed to look like that. Bottom line is it really doesn't even matter. Like, that's just an added insult onto the injury of not having any fucking gameplay expression in your game. Any ability for the player to say, I want to do things this way. And any element of dynamism. Dude, I co-cast with a guy named fucking Dynamo. You think I like some dynamism in my games? Yeah, I would. Unfortunately, all you get is static linear bullshit. And you can't really escape from linear, but you can escape from static. And you owe it to players who are actually trying to play a game and not just experience some cutscene movie storyline, StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void LOL, to actually make a game that requires them to be good at it in order to progress. If they give enough of a fuck about your story because you wrote a good story, then they will improve. Or they'll look it up on YouTube, in which case you're really fucked. Bye.